always like to do a lot of research before I start a painting, especially when it's something I'm only somewhat familiar with. For this painting I'm working on now, or this one I'm starting, painting subject is Uller. Uller is very much a lost god, or a god just on the edge of our human memory. So one of the things I do is sometimes I'll call a friend, and that's what you're going to hear now as you see me go about the process of making the drawing and even eventually starting on the initial painting. Called up my buddy Brian Marshall, who is degree in history and reads a lot when it comes to the Norse lore, but also happens to make his living carving drinking horns. And I've done a lot of different projects for Fateful Signs with Brian, and he's definitely one of my main go-to guys. He's just very knowledgeable, but also we have good conversations. So as you watch me draw, hopefully that's enjoyable, but more so, give a listen as the two of us sort of kick around ideas of, who is Uller, where did he come from, and what does that say about us as a modern people? I think it's something you'll dig. Thanks.
Brian Marshall.
All right, cool. I'm Sam Flegel. So I guess to start with, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm talking to you. In your day job is you carve horns, you carve drinking horns, and sell them all over the world, but mostly at Renaissance festivals and reenactment events, right?
That is correct. Yeah.
And today we're talking about Uller. And am I saying that right? Is that how you'd say it? Is Uller?
Yes. Yeah, that's how I would say it.
And I guess my first real encounter with Uller outside of the lore is that it wasn't too long ago, for I guess it was 2 or 3 years in a row, you were hosting the Feast of Uller.
Yes, that's correct.
So
Yeah, early December usually.
So what? Yeah, in December, what made you want to do that? I mean, there's so many gods and goddesses you could have picked from. Why Uller?
Um, well, that's a really good question because sometimes I don't know if I'm 100% sure. I personally just felt drawn to do it. It's kind of a lot of people had been doing, or I had heard of Feast of Uller around Thanksgiving time, treating him sort of as like a hunter's feast, so to speak.
Sure, I can see that.
And I had grown curious about Uller and trying to understand a bit more just because it's, what information we have is very, very, very scant. And I'd grown curious just based on the imagery and the motifs and so forth. And so I kind of put this idea together that I really wanted to do. I wanted to do something then. I felt compelled to, to try to understand a bit more. I guess is maybe the long and short of it. Plus, it was a good time of year for me, in terms of it's also my slow season. So, and it was a time when other people had maybe a little bit of time on their hands, so it was easier to, get people to gather together.
Yeah.
And so it sort of made an obvious focal point at the time.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing a lot of research on Uller recently. I'm working on a new piece related to Uller, and something I thought was interesting right off the bat is that he's only referenced a few times, but in the sources where he's referenced, they're the oldest sources that we have available. And so there's
absolutely
this clear picture that at a time before written record, he was immensely important. There's also, and again, whenever you use a Roman source, there's some question as to how valid it is, but there is some reference in Roman sources that Uller actually was the main god above, I believe it's Thor and Odin in the writing.
Yeah, I like you said. I mean, it's really hard to tell whenever you're dealing with anything Roman, because primarily what you've got is Tacitus, which how much understanding he had or how much actual exposure he even had to Germanic cults is, really questionable. But I mean, you're absolutely right in that it's painfully obvious that Uller was at one time, if not the most important god to the Bronze Age Scandinavian cult. He was certainly one of, 2 or 3 that were easily the most important. And all kinds of records would indicate that. I mean, if nothing else, the sheer volume of place names in Scandinavia that reference Uller is actually pretty staggering. I mean, you're talking about, I mean, dozens and dozens, far more than. I'm gonna have to sit down with it for sure, but I'd say probably more than any other god. He has place names
Yeah,
dedicated to him,
I was reading about it.
especially Sweden and southeast Norway.
Yeah, I was reading about that, and it's pretty close to like the number of place names that Thor has in terms of uh, the amount. So I mean, that's a whole lot. Um,
Right, exactly.
yeah, and what's interesting though with the Uller ones is they also often in the name refer to something indicating a temple or a sacred
Hmm.
space. So whatever, often they just refer to farms or hills in modern times. But when you pick apart the name, it would be a place where Uller had a temple essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's archaeological evidence that was the case as well.
Yeah,
We have
absolutely.
lots of, you know, we can get into that in a minute or two, but I mean, yeah, lots of archaeological evidence, especially in terms of oath rings, which of course has got a strong significance to Uller. And also, oftentimes these place names also have references even to other gods as well. So you might have a place name that references both Uller and Freyr, for example. Um, so you kind of get a bit of a picture as far as what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I guess kind of a general overview about Uller is often, he's viewed, of course, as the god of ice skating and of skiing,
Hmm.
the god of the snowshoes, a god of hunting and of archery, connected specifically with the yew tree, which was often created into yew bows. He was specifically to be invoked before a duel, which I thought was interesting. So some sort of bond of ritual combat, and then I guess the most famous thing is lots of reference to warrior related things like Uller's ship is a shield, Uller's brands are a sword, and so a warlike hunter god kind of picks in there, but also there's some indication that he was probably some sort of a winter king, which I think is really interesting because there's the very specific reference that when Odin was gone in winter, which implies that while Odin's off on the wild hunt, running about the land, leading the ancestral procession, that it was Uller who was trusted to sit on the throne. I don't know. So what are your thoughts on that?
Um, okay, well, there's several pieces we got to unpack. As far as we can start with Uller and replacing Odin as let's say on the high seat during a certain portion of the year. Um, I mean, I think that Saxo Grammaticus, I think, is where we get that particular piece of information from. It's the idea that for 10 years Uller replaced Odin as Odin, which we've kind of expounded on in a lot of different ways to come up with this idea of him, taking over in the high seat while Odin is away with the wild hunt. Which, uh, well, an interesting piece of research, which I find extremely compelling, especially the more that I read about it, the more I read it, and the more I try to kind of digest the information that's in it, is the idea that Uller is the original god of the sun, as in the Bronze Age god of the sun. And if we look at him in that, if we look at him in that lens, um, most of the wintertime, as we know it, and in a modern sense, I mean, as in everything post the winter solstice, the majority of the wintertime is actually in the time when the sun is has been born and is growing towards midsummer. So the winter season, in some ways, is the sun season. It's coming back. It's growing. Um, let's go another direction as well. Um, the shield of Uller, which, of course, we have these different notions of the theory being that the shield of Uller is the sun disk itself. This is where his name comes from. His name is actually from Old Gothic, which they think is Wulthor, which means glory or radiance.
I mean, we're starting to get this image of an older sun god.
Yeah.
Um, and when you look at sun gods as an archetype in many different cultures, immediately the connection to both archery and hunting and the sun wheel or the shield, any sort of circle, a disc, those are common throughout many cultures, also viewing the sun as a warrior, heroic figure doing battle with darkness, or the creatures of the unknown chaos of darkness, common in so many cultures.
Absolutely true. I mean, the most obvious and direct example perhaps being Apollo, the archer in ancient Greece, who is the sun god, who is, a defender of humans and all kinds of things like this, a warrior.
Yeah.
Uh,
Also, a connection to healing and the healing
sure.
properties of the sun. Um, so yeah, so you do get this idea of a much more prominent figure. And I really liked. Now this is all supposition, but I read um, a blog post that was talking about some different theories, and one that I really latched onto is the idea of, so if Uller is ruling in winter, which there's got to be a strong connection to winter, and that's where I think Uller gets interesting, is because there's not a lot of connections to sun gods in winter, but
Sure.
in Uller we have those things paired, and so I'm thinking about like Odin representing the darker nature of winter, that scary part, the when he joins the wild hunt and leads the ancestors through the land, and that rejuvenates the land, but also there's tons of information about the wild hunt being a thing one doesn't just join to without consequence. That when mortals get entangled with that there's dangers to dealing with the ghosts and spirits that are out at that time of darkness. But then you think
Sure.
about the winter sun god ruling during that time and representing all the good things about winter, like skating and skiing, winter sports, hunting in winter time, and the idea that the sun is still there to protect us, just to a lesser degree during that time of darkness, and as the sun grows throughout winter, as you said, towards the summertime.
Odin is, in many facets, he's a god of death.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
This is one of his primary, say, shall we call it, aspect, is death. And I mean, if we think of it in a larger meta sort of context, half of the year half of the year the sun is dying, half of the year the sun is growing. So the time when Odin is at his strongest, is building up to into the depths of the winter, when the land is dying and everything else is coming, and then of course we transfer to that point in the year where the sun begins to grow again. So it's almost like the focus of worship then can change from one to the other, and you start worshiping the sun again because you start saying, okay, we need the sun to come back so crops will grow again, so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
As opposed to the other end where you have Odin, but you need the cycle. Everything needs to happen that certain way, in order for the gland to come back, for everything to maintain its balance. You need the Odinic part of the year, so to speak.
Absolutely. And so, I mean,
So,
you get a pretty clear picture of the importance of this figure. Also, there's a very specific reference that any oath of significance was sworn 3 different times, and the third time was always sworn by Uller, that Uller was the final holder of the oath. Now, similar records exist in a later period that reference Thor as being the final holder of the oath, as Thor grew into prominence in what most people would think of as the migration period, or very specifically Viking times. And then you had mentioned to me about an archaeological dig, and I did a little research, and I may say this wrong, in Lilja Ulve, which is the little shrine of Uller, which was excavated in 2007 in Uppland near Stockholm in Sweden. And they found essentially this temple that had been all laid out, but within the temple, buried a little deeper, they found over 65 oath rings made primarily of iron. They were unadorned rings, just if you imagine a simple iron bar in a circle tied together. And they found, and this is a huge, 65 in one place is a lot. And so here we have an example of this temple to Uller, the little shrine of Ul, and within it are these oath rings, and then we have the written record where it says the final oath should be sworn to Uller, and you begin to see, his significance had to be as great as we think of Thor in the modern stories at that time. and had a deep connection to oaths.
Absolutely. And I mean, and one of the speculations there, of course, being that the oath ring is a symbol for the sun itself. That the sun disk and the oath ring both being, conjoined circles, having some relative significance to each other. But I mean, and that, sort of the final oath out in the light of the sun sort of thing, for the whole world to see kind of thing. But I mean, you're absolutely right in that it's extremely clear that at some point he had a place of prominence that was profound. I mean, you're talking about, but again, we're probably talking about the Bronze Age cult. And then, like you said, the very early migration period until the cult, he was just, he was supplanted, and, Freyr and Thor began to take his place.
Yeah, I read some theories, and again, these are pretty wild, that Frey may actually be Uller, because the word Frey, just like his sister Freya, it just means lord and lady. And so if it, at one point in time, could have been said Lord Ul or Lord Uller, and then it was shortened to Frey.
Yeah.
I also like the idea, I read a little thing about how if Uller is the winter sun, then Frey is the summer sun, when the sun is, a young man, fresh and full of vigor, and Uller is the old man sun, sort of, looking down from the sky as a more fatherly figure than the youthful hero figure.
Sure. I mean, that's, I think that's a reasonable supposition. Kind of maybe different, different aspects in their idea. So, on one side you have Freyr, who's kind of, who's frequently associated with, fertility and plenty, specifically from the earth itself. So it's half of that dynamic. The other half, of course, being the sky providing, the rain and all this other kind of stuff. You have this one side where Freyr is very much like a chthonic deity, the chthonic portion of the deity of the earth, and Ur is very much the other half of that, which is of the sky. So, just a theory, just a thought.
Though I did read another thing I liked very well that referred to Uller as the god of circles, which I really liked the connection, because as we've talked, you have the oath ring, the sun, the shield, even his connection to the bow. When a bow is pulled most taut, it creates a semicircle, and there's long been a connection to the idea of like the crescent moon as a bow in the sky, and you think of that as a piece of a circle. The circle of the death and rebirth, the idea of the world is a circle, the earth is a circle, the circle.
Time is a circle.
Exactly, time is a circle was where I was going. Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's exactly. I'm glad we're on the same wavelength here. I also saw a great little note that for one who wishes to make an offering to Uller, that the libation Jägermeister is an excellent choice to Uller. Jägermeister, of course, translating to mean master hunter. And, you think of Jaeger's symbol is the stag. Uller being, in the lore, Uller is actually referred to as master hunter in one of his names. Not specifically the German Jägermeister, but that's a later cognate of that. Which kind of leads me, again, with that Frey connection. It's been theorized that Freyr may have had horns, but long in old culture were stag horns or the horns of a hind referenced as a crown, and that a king, be it a winter king or a king at any time, would wear the stag horns as a crown. In fact, there's lots of reference to this as the earliest form of the crown would be to take two horns and tie them together in a circlet and place that on the king's head, which also connects to many different horned gods. And so you think of like the hunter's crown also being that of the stag. I think you can see why people would make that connection, and also it's sort of a fun thing too.
Sure, yeah. Well, and I also think that's one thing that I find interesting about it as well, about especially if you want to put it in the context of Uller, is the stag crown, so to speak, is actually it's a cyclical crown, in that stags as an animal wear their crowns part of the year, not the whole year.
Ah, yeah, sure.
they drop them. They wear them for rut season. They grow them early in the year, but then they wear them for rut season, and then as soon as the winter really gets going, they actually drop them. So, I find that to be an interesting connection by itself as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The last little bit of research I did that I thought is interesting is that in the last, say, 20 years or so, there's been a huge resurgence of Uller being tied to winter game festivals.
Yeah.
Specifically in Colorado, here in America, they have an Uller Fest every year that's just crazy. And when you think about it, I love this idea of modern people invoking this ancient winter king during winter. And what are they doing? I mean, they're skiing, they're ice skating, they're doing winter sports, winter games, but also I can guarantee there is libation and toasting to Uller. And to me, it seems like it would very much feel like a pagan festival in honor of this older being. And to me, that completes the concept of the circle. In that, here we are over 1,000 years later, and we still feel a call to invoke this ancient power.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's part of the. I mean, I think that's part of the power of these various ancient deities is that they after a fashion kind of refuse to be forgotten. There's you find these things where people feel compelled, because I mean they could have just as easily, they could have picked any name to decide, oh, we're gonna name after whatever, but they chose a god of winter, so to speak, to carry on that legacy. And I just find it really, I find that in and of itself, in sort of our, if you want to call it the Jungian collective unconscious, like we have this compelling desire to continue the legacy, or continue the memory of these various deities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's how you ended up with your festival, as you said, or the Feast of Uller. Why did you do it? Your answer was, I don't know exactly, but it felt right. And I think that's the thing I keep coming back to is our people. If you want to think of the Northern Europeans, or however you view that to come down to, Western culture has had a connection with this spirit of winter for so long that it just won't go away. It can't go away. And I don't know. I find that to be really powerful and special.
Yeah, absolutely. It's remembering that all times of the year are not the same time of year. You know what I mean? Like we in our post-agrarian society, our industrial society, we've lost our connection with with the seasons of the earth in a lot of ways, because for a lot of us, really the only difference is what do I put on when I go to my office job? Am I dressing for when it's cold outside or when it's warm outside? There's not really a meaningful difference. I can find the same food in my grocery store, all year long. But these are kind of almost like our ancestral memories reminding us that, that all times are not exactly the same. That there are differences in the seasons and so forth. And, we have a connection to those things, and, and they impact our lives, whether we see it as prominently as we used to or not.
Yeah. That's great. Well, Brian, thanks so much for talking to me today, man. I really appreciate all your thoughts.
Yeah, always a pleasure, man.
Hey, I'm Sam Flegel, and thanks for listening to me and my friend Brian talk about the god Uller. If it's the sort of content you enjoy, please head on over to fatefulsigns.com and sign up for the mailing list. Also want to give a special shout out to all my patrons over at patreon.com. They're the ones who make this sort of thing possible. So thank you guys so much. You can go to patreon.com/Sam Flegel if you want to support me there. Also, big thanks to Everyday Original for pushing me and giving me the opportunity to create this painting and partner up with them. Thanks, Mark and Lauren. You guys are the best.